Excellent. Okay, I am so excited to talk with you today, Uma. Welcome to the Radical Good podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Radha, and it's nice to be able to see your face.
It is really lovely to be able to see your face as well. Feeling a little bit disconnected after pandemic times, especially from people in different parts of the world.
Yes. Yeah, we meet each other at a conference once, and then 3 years later, we're like, oh, hey, I remember you.
Remember when we used to meet in person and we didn't do
Right.
conversations on Zoom?
Yes.
Exactly. Another lifetime.
Yeah.
Well, I'm so excited to talk with you today, but also to get to share some of your story with the world. And I wonder if we could just start the conversation by talking a little bit about your journey. How did you get started and how did you come to this work?
Which work are we talking about? I've had so many jobs that over the course of my life, from the military to teaching to working in the medical, sector to tutoring to running global movements, fighting for racial equity and supporting human rights defenders. So it's been, I guess that's the journey. How I got started on it is like, I think how everyone that is from a culture of immigrants and, from a background that encapsulates what people of culture have to move through, is we just seize the opportunities that are in front of us, because that's the way that we move through the world. And that's the way I've moved through the world. It's like, oh, I don't actually want to be doing this anymore. I'm going to now pivot to this, and it's going to be scary, but it's what my parents did. It's what probably my grandparents did. It's like, this is what we do, is we find the opportunity that's in front of us. And if we can't find it, then we make it, Yeah.
The last time I'd almost forgotten that your path wound in such a really beautiful and unexpected way. And I think that so many of us don't have a straight linear path to the work that we feel really called to do. But the last time that you and I really had a long conversation, you were leading the Global Women's March, which to many people who hear it, they will remember as the largest single day protest in history, but also something quite profound that had a lot of pieces to it, because it was promoting a feminist economic system that actually values everyone and their labor. It was also about reimagining democracy in a way that really serves everyone. And it was about really addressing the underlying white supremacy in our systems. And now you are one of the co-founders of this Racial Equity Index, which is really about holding accountable the development sector, the whole global development sector, at a time when this sector is really having a reckoning.
Yeah.
So maybe we can narrow our lens slightly to talk about pivoting from one huge monumental shift to the next.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I don't see it as much of a pivot. All of our existence is so deeply interconnected, and the issues that we have to move through are so deeply interconnected. And while the global development sector and funders especially love to segment things and silo things, and say, we're going to fund women's rights, and then we'll fund racial equity, and then we'll fund, something else over here. It all affects us in some way, shape, or form, right? And so I don't see it as a huge pivot moving from being the ED of a global women's rights movement to then fighting for racial equity and justice in global development. Because for me, I've been impacted by both things so deeply and continue to be impacted by both things, and I think the thing that I guess was the biggest trigger for me in putting the call out for the Racial Equity Index was my experience organizing in the women's rights space and observing how organizers of color specifically were sidelined, were their ideas co-opted, how damaging white feminism was and still continues to be within the sector at large, but also within the women's rights space. And the level of racism that was happening within the women's rights movement, and witnessing all of that, but also experiencing all of that, and finding it very hard to believe that for a sector whose whole ideology is built upon wanting to do good, that we still have to remind the sector to care about something, and I had a friend say to me the other day, actually it was one of our collective members in our podcast the other day, and she said, if we have to remind people to care about something, they don't actually care in the first place. If we have to remind people to care about racial equity, they never really cared in the first place. Why is it in 2022 that we don't have any data on racial equity in terms of organizations and global development? Why is it that we're still signing up to pledge to do racial equity? What does that even mean? Shouldn't we even, we should be so far along, on this journey. And so I think for me, it's less of a pivot and more of a dedicated effort to really being radical in my approach and what I give my time to.
I so appreciate everything you just said. And I kind of want to go slowly through this because there were so many deep pieces in there that are really important. And one of them to me was about how I have to remember sometimes when I'm doing this work that everybody is on a different place in their journey. And every day somebody out there is having day one. Every day somebody out there is having this moment where they realize, oh my God, this is incredibly structural. This is reinforced at all of these different levels, and I am part of the problem. And at the same time, on the other end of the spectrum, I find that the deeper I go into this work, the less patience I have for that. And to hold that compassion for people who are waking up to it and recognizing, okay, as a white woman, I really have a responsibility to clean up some of this mess that I am benefiting from and have historically benefited from. And at the same time, really hold this frustration that it should not take this to wake people up. And when I read on social media, people saying in a well-meaning way, I can't believe this. I never realized things were so bad. I want to slam the computer and say, how could it possibly be that you haven't noticed that you're just waking up to this today? And holding those two truths is really a challenge in doing this work. And I hope that for any white women listening, that they really hear that deeply on all levels.
Yeah. I think, the thing that we have to really remember is that when we're looking at the system of global development at large, this is a system that was built upon the legacy of colonialism. And I'd say legacy, but it's actually a reality because it's still, colonialism still is happening, right? If we look at Puerto Rico, if we look at Hawaii, in so many different ways, right? And so it's built upon the reality of colonialism. It's built upon the reality of the 400 years of history of enslavement, and so many other, the colonization of Turtle Island. There's so many things here that global development has been built on, and at its root, it is rotten. The foundation of global development is rotten, right? It's hard to say that openly in this sector. But the thing is, if we don't acknowledge that that is our starting point, and so all of us carry a responsibility for that history, and upholding that history. And so it's all of our work to understand the impacts of that legacy, especially, from a somatic perspective, and how we reinforce it or how we change it. You're absolutely right. It is all of our responsibilities, but definitely the responsibility of white women, especially within the global development sector, because there's a lot of white feminism, and it is not a pretty sight, and it is very, very violent towards bodies of culture.
Absolutely. I could not agree more. Can you talk a little bit more about how the Racial Equity Index came to be? Can you talk a little bit about its origin story?
Yeah, absolutely. So I put a call out. I'm the initiator of and the facilitator of the Racial Equity Index, and I put a call out in June of 2020, apologies, in July of 2020, after the murder of George Floyd and the massive rupture that cracked open, not only within the global development sector, but the world at large, right? And we saw these reckonings coming through, the racism, within Women Deliver, or Nobel Women's Initiative, or Oxfam, or Doctors Without Borders, right? We saw all of these Guardian articles and other articles coming through about systemic racism in these organizations. And I knew from my experience as an organizer, but also as an ED, that the next steps for the sector would probably be hiring a whole bunch of consultants to do more equity work. I mean, they were already out there, but it would just now increase, right? And that's not accountability, nor is it justice, nor is it reparations, nor is it actually acknowledging the harm that has been caused, right? At the core of the experience of what happens in terms of racial violence and racism, it's a visceral experience. It harms people mentally, physically, psychologically. And we expect people in the global development sector, especially bodies of culture, to somehow stomach all of that and yet show up to work to move the needle forward on issues that impact all of us. How is that possible? How is that possible that we are asking a whole body of people to continue working in conditions that harm them, and yet there is no accountability for how they are treated, and there's no accountability for the CEOs that uphold really violent workplace cultures, right? And HR policies? How is that there is no accountability or reporting, for that matter? And so I was looking at all of what was coming out and talking to a lot of my sisters in this sector, and being really frustrated at just the statements that were coming out by organizations that we all knew were racist, and CEOs that we all knew upheld really, really horrible systems of racial violence. And I put this call out. There's a lot of gender equality indexes in the global development sector that look at gender equality in organizations. None of them measured racial equity at that point. None of them were even considering it. And I, said to a friend of mine, I'm like, we need an index for racial equity. We need a way to hold organizations accountable for racial equity in global development. I don't know how we're going to do it. This is such a big thing. And so we need to build a collective of people. And so I put this call out on Twitter and LinkedIn. I think in a week, over 200 people had signed up. And now, 2 years later, we are a collective of 12 people from all around the world, all BIPOC people in global development. We have over 50 years of experience. We have 6 peer reviewers, because as BIPOC folks, our work is hyper, analyzed. And so our work is peer reviewed, and we are well on our way as volunteers, because we can talk about why funding is a challenge for this work, but as volunteers, we are well on our way to now building the first pilot for the Racial Equity Index. But that was how we started.
It's incredible. It's really been wonderful to watch this start and grow and take hold in more popular culture. Really, truly. Can you talk a little bit about why, on a personal level, it's so important to you to invest in voices that have been historically underrepresented, underinvested in, historically marginalized. I mean, what's at stake?
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot about my own life, and I said this in an interview a few years ago, and I've never forgotten it. I think a lot about the fact, and especially being the mom to a 7-year-old, and I'm for me, it's so important that I'm raising my child so that she has as much space as possible to find her voice. But I didn't find my voice until, my goodness, what, my 30s, right? Because there was so much surviving that I had to do. And this is so true with other bodies of culture, with people from, with people from families that are first generation immigrants, right? We have to survive. And then when we're maybe 40, we're like, maybe I actually don't want to do this career path, and I actually want to go to school and do this, right? So it takes us a long time to get out of survival mode to be able to even find our voice, right? So I think my responsibility as a citizen is to really ensure that that timeline is shortened for people who look like me, so that we can have strong, incredible leaders leading, who know who they are and who know that their voice matters in totality. And there's no questioning that. That's not something that I had in my teens or in my 20s, right? It really only arrived for me much later in life, and I say that now as a 40-year-old, but for me, that is why I do what I do. That's why I wrote a kid's book. That's why I'm fighting for accountability in terms of racial equity. Like, it's just, it matters to me a lot.
I think that's so beautifully said. And I think about this all the time. This, if you can't see it, you can't be it. And what a difference it makes for people to see representation in that way. It just makes me so happy thinking about the future instead of like, oh my God, we are screwed. It makes me so happy to see that representation.
Right. I think, and yet it's amazing to see the representation, but what is so motivating, but also just like, come on, do we still have to have these conversations, is the resistance to seeing that level of representation, right? We can take a look at, the Disney movie that just came out, Turning Red, and the big, uproar that has unleashed about how we talk about young girls and puberty and that experience of periods. Oh my God, the word period, right? Why is this a big deal? But it is, right? But again, those stories matter, and we need to hear them, and we need to see them, and it's way overdue, and yet we still have to fight for them. It's bananas.
Do you have a particular story that you ever think about where you witnessed a barrier being removed or resources finally being provided that really supported women, and particularly women of color, in the ways that allowed them to thrive and not just survive?
Oh, goodness. That is a really great question, because I have a hard time saying that, the women of color in my life that I know are out there thriving. I think it's a mix of thriving and surviving. And I think about, for example, one of my, during my time at Women's March Global, one of the mini grants that we gave out was to an organizer in Cameroon, incredible organizer, but literally this was like a case of survival. She used the mini grant to hold first aid courses, because she lived in a conflict zone. First aid courses on how to literally treat gunshot wounds and give rapid first aid and CPR. And like, that's the level of survival that we have to do. I would love to be able to say, yes, this level of resource was delivered and now everyone's thriving. But that's just not the case. There are people, I think about, for example, Lujane's case, and this is the most recent case of a human rights defender that I've worked on for a long time. Is Lujane thriving? She can't speak. She can't leave the country, even though she's released from prison, even though there were years spent on her case. Is that thriving, or is that still surviving, right? Should we celebrate that as thriving? It's a hard question.
Yeah, it is a very difficult question, and it has a lot of layers to it. And I think part of the reason that I ask, and that I like to think about the stories that motivate us to do the work that we do, and remind us why it's so important to do this kind of work and what's at stake, is because I spend a lot of the day talking with often companies and organizations who want to do good in the world, right? Fundamentally, that's the bottom line. They want to do good. And they are overwhelmed by everything that entails and what it means to go up against the system. And they don't necessarily have a lot of models and examples where they've seen it done effectively. And it feels really overwhelming. And so the reason I ask that question is because I like to sometimes provide visuals of what could be possible. Do things differently. What could be possible in a world where everybody could thrive, where everybody had the resources they needed, and we weren't working with systems that were ultimately and initially created by taking other people's resources and hoarding them, but we're really thinking about fair ways to equitably distribute them so that everyone was part of a society where they were cared for.
Yeah, I think, two things when it's framed in that way come to mind. One is, like, I look at, for example, what Frida, the Young Feminist Fund, is doing and what they've always committed to in terms of their radical approach and supporting, supporting the population that they support, right? But being incredibly unapologetic about how they approach their giving, and how, the roots of philanthropy, right? They are unafraid of addressing, like, what are the roots and how is this reparations, right? They just received $10 million from Mackenzie.
I was just going to say that. I just saw the news today. It's incredible.
It's amazing, but their statement is even more, I think, powerful, just in terms of the reminder that it provides us of the fact that, this is amazing, but it's also overdue, and it's reparations, and that this is how the money is going to be used. The other thing that I'm thinking about is, within our collective, so we are, BIPOC-led collective, we're collective decision makers. So we don't, it's not one person leading the work and making unilateral decisions. So it takes time, and we're intentional in our approach. It's been really incredible for us to move through this work. I mean, this work is very difficult. We're building an accountability system for an issue that impacts us as people of color, right? And as Black people in our collective. And so it's not easy work. The mental toll that it has taken on our collective is incredible and devastating. And I remember a conversation, I think maybe towards the end of last year, where we meet every Friday, for our weekly working group call. And we showed up, and there was just this silence. We just held silence. We didn't say much. And it was towards the end of the call that someone put in the Zoom chat, I have tears streaming down my face, and this is the most love and seen I've felt. And we met then a week later, and I think someone had said something about, we're building the space that we've always needed, right? And I think about this a lot, right? When we work with intention, when we work with humanity in mind and our humanness in mind, and approach this work with the understanding that it is fatiguing work on every level, and yet it is also critical and overdue, how can we ensure that we're not redistributing systems of violence even within our own approach? And it's been a very intentional process for us to create a space where we all feel safe, but it's been difficult. It's not been an easy process for us. And I think if we're talking about radical approaches and where we can see, that there are things that actually work, it's like, look at the organizations that are being led with intention. Look at the organizations that are being led with an understanding of racial justice. Look at the organizations that are wholly anti-racist, so that we can see how we can organize in a way where we don't continue to harm each other.
Ooh, I love all of that. I really want to sit with that. I was going to ask, in light of the pandemic, what is something that has changed the way that you think about how we can ensure people who've been historically marginalized, especially women of color, especially women with disabilities or who are LGBTQ, are safe and supported? And I feel like you answered that by telling that story about creating the space that you always needed, and maybe didn't know exactly that's what you needed, but that's what you needed.
Right.
I think that's going to be a really important part of how we're building back. I mean, one of the things about this pandemic is there's just no way to escape how every crack in our system was exposed, right? The sunlight that shone on all of those cracks made it impossible not to see how things need to change. And I hope that we really are not going back to business as usual, but stepping forward in a different way with different wisdom. And I think a lot of that really is somatic wisdom about how we feel differently in our bodies after having been forced to do things differently in our normal daily routines these last 2 years.
Right. I was watching a reel on Instagram of this young Black woman who was like, I used to get up at 5 a.m. to go and drive to the gym, to go work out, and then come back and shower so that I could go on a subway at 7 to go to a job, and then sit in the office until 7 or 8 p.m. and then come back and do that all over again every single day. She's like, what world was that? And I think this realization that we have been so embedded in this white supremacy culture way of working, right? That we are beholden to be in an office at a certain time and do X number of hours, and even work when we get home, and work on the weekends, and work on our vacations, because that's what we do as adults, is just work ourselves to death, not work to actually live or work to actually be with family, but work so we can just be a cog in the wheel. There's so many, I think, that have awakened to the fact that the system was never designed for us. It was never designed for us. And so we have every right to say that we are not part of this anymore, and we will not be part of it. And we have our demands and we have our requirements for how we will work and how we will show up and how we will live, from here on out, because that is our right as human beings.
100%. There is a really beautiful piece in there's a podcast on the 19th. Oh, I'm going to totally butcher it now, so I really apologize. But it talks about, in one of the first episodes, how this country created this culture of equating your worth with constant production. And how deeply that has become ingrained into our culture. We don't just allow ourselves to be in the moment. We equate our worth with our ability to produce for someone else.
Right, right. But it's not even, that produce, not being able to pause. Like, I'm a somatic abolitionist in training, and I will always say in training. But so much of the work of somatic abolition is the understanding that we have not been given an opportunity to pause and really feel the impact that racism has had on our body, whether it's a white body, whether it's a body of culture. We have not been allowed to pause, but the system literally won't allow us to pause. We have to produce. We have to live one traumatic event and then move on to the next and the next and the next and the next. And we can't feel it, And if we do have any dissenting opinions about the traumatic event that has happened, we just have to shut those back off and then go back to living in this ridiculous cycle over and over again. No, thank you.
When you said the word pause, I just involuntarily stopped and took a deep breath. And I think I'm going to incorporate that into my daily routine for the next week or so. Just a reminder of what that space feels like when we are allowed to stop for a moment and pause.
Yeah.
It's really powerful.
Yeah.
I really want to ask you what it is that you love about the work that you do.
I love people. Which is weird for me because I'm an introvert, right? So I like people, but from a massive distance.
I like them on the other side of the Zoom screen.
Exactly. As long as they're on the other side of Zoom. If they have to be in person, I will bring deodorant because I will be very sweaty and anxious, and it's just not going to be a good look. No, but in all seriousness, I love people. I love organizing with people. I love the transformation that a collective can have when focused on an issue, but I also love the individual transformation that can take place within a collective if it's a supported space for collective healing and restoration. Like, I have seen that this has been one of the most beautiful aspects of the Racial Equity Index, is that we have all felt seen and supported in the most difficult work, I think, that we're doing within a sector that doesn't want us to do the work. And so my love for anything that I do is people. Always.
Beautiful. It's beautiful. I think that I'm going to guess that a lot of the individuals who are listening to this podcast are really, wherever they are in their equity journey, looking for ways that they can support, get involved, and in particular, think differently about how they're using their resources to advance equity in different ways. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on, in particular, investing in women and girls of color, women and girls who are queer, women and girls with disabilities, women and girls who have historically had the least access to resources, but have been the absolute backbone behind every social progress movement in history. Do you have any thoughts or advice on ways that people can help?
Yeah, I'm going to say, if you're a philanthropist, funder, individual donor listening to this, if you say that you do trust-based philanthropy, actually do it. Meaning, and what I mean by that is like, trust people. So don't go in there with your own programmatic ideas of how something should be done. If you're supporting and you want to support Black-led movements and movements led by people of culture, trust that they probably already have the solution. They just need the resources to be able to implement that solution. And the only thing that you have to do is just sit, kind of on the sidelines and watch us work, right? And learn from it as well. It's a really hands-off approach, but that's what we need right now. We need people to trust that we have the knowledge and the capacity to be able to deliver the solutions that are needed. We just need the resources. I think for executives within the global development space, though, there's also I think we need to do a better job of really ensuring that if we say we're going to support, collectives, for example, like ours, like the Racial Equity Index, that support isn't just housed within a space that is comfortable, that is traditional, right? If we're going to actually meet the challenges that we are confronted with, especially in this sector, it is way overdue that our approach is radical and transformative, right? So nothing about what we should be doing, and I guess this is my point, should be comfortable. Nothing should be comfortable right now. None of us are comfortable. So why should any of our approaches be traditional or comfortable? Everything should feel a bit sticky and a bit uncomfortable. And if it doesn't, then you're probably adhering to some norms that are not so great in 2022.
I love it. I love it so much that I want to like write it down and put it on a sticky note on my computer and think about that every day, next to all the other sticky notes that say progress, not perfection, and stop doing either or thinking, and every other bad, white dominant culture trait that shows up in the work that we do every single day. Okay, Uma.
Yeah.
Who inspires you?
I think the people that do the most and don't even know that they're doing the most. So I like the people that, the person that continues to inspire me is my daughter always, because I think the youth just have a foresight, and an openness to seeing things, and they will speak the truth. But I think as well, human rights defenders, and I look at Lujane, who are unapologetic in their approach, and those that are on the front lines, but also the people that we don't traditionally place in this sector, so the people that are the domestic care workers and medical workers that have been ground to the bone, working to deliver literally, life to people in a pandemic, and have not been supported in the way that they have needed at all, right? And have continued to show up to work, continued to support all of us in this. Like, those are the people that are inspiring to me. And it's just, I think we as a collective body of humanity, we need to understand that we're all feeling every single one of the effects of these past 2 years. And so we need to be inspired by what everyone is doing, because it's all tiring and it's all exhausting. We're all trying.
Is there anything else that we didn't have an opportunity to cover today that you really want to talk about, that you think would be important for people who are listening?
Oh, make sure you tell your stories. And we started the conversation off by you reflecting on this as well. But I'm thinking a lot these days about whose stories we hear and whose stories we don't. And I mentioned earlier, I wrote a children's book, Lujane Dreams of Sunflowers, about Lujane El Hathloul, the Saudi human rights defender that was in prison for 1,001 days for driving a car in Saudi Arabia, among other things, right? And she was brutally tortured, and her sister and I co-wrote a children's book, and it's a beautiful representation. But it's interesting because even in the process of writing that book, we were confronted by editors who were like, why are you writing a fictional story? It's based on her life, but it's magical, and there's dreamscape in it. And why shouldn't there be? Because kids that are of that are of color deserve those magical dreamscapes. And it's like the stories that we need to hear are the ones that we need to see every day, the ones that we need to experience, and those can only come from us. And so if there's anything that I could leave people with, is make sure you tell your stories, not when the time is dwindling, but now.
I think that was such a perfect note to end on. Thank you so much for sharing that, and thank you so much for talking with me on the podcast today.
Oh, thank you so much, Radha, for everything that you do.
Okay, I'm going to officially end the recording.
Yay!